Hotels, saloons, moving pictures, the opera. This is the story of Block 29, Wymore, Nebraska. I'd rather be someone's shot of whiskey than everyone's cup of tea. When Wymore's town plat was recorded on May 21, 1881, 20 business lots had already been sold and building had begun. 2 months later, the new town recorded 60 businesses and houses. In 1883, the population reached 2,000. Growing pains of the new town filled the air with sounds of the railroad, ringing engine bells of which no two were the same, whistles, some with moans, others with short, hard blasts, trains arriving and departing. The sounds of construction was heard on every block, hammers and saws, and wagons delivering building materials. The first buildings on Block 29 were one-story frame structures built quickly with immediate need. The B&M house on Lot 8 served as a rooming house. The Potter House claimed to be the first hotel, facing Blue River Street. It was successful until the late 1880s when the Touzalin opened its doors, and afterward the old hotel fell into decline. After several attempts by arsonists to remove it, it was torn down in 1899. Richard and Ann Livsey were among the first residents of Wymore. Their home was located at 4th and K Street. Richard served as Justice of the Peace, among other civic duties. He and his family managed their opera building until his death in 1899. From the 1888 Weekly Wymorean. The structure is of brick upon a stone basement and was completed in 1882. It is 50 by 100 foot with a basement 10 feet deep. The first floor ceiling is 14 foot, the second 19. The basement is floored and wainscoted and is the full size of the upper stories, making a number of nice rooms for storage and other purposes. The ground floors are occupied, one by the Boston Tea Company, with an immense stock of groceries, and the other by the post office and A. Davidson's newsstand. The opera hall is seated with chairs and has a capacity of 700. The stage is 24 by 50 foot and is provided with 4 dressing rooms, 11 complete sets of scenery painted by the famous artists Soseman and Landis of Chicago at a cost of $700. The stage and hall are lighted by gas and provided with every convenience found in any theater outside the large cities. Through the 1880s, well into the early 1900s, the opera building welcomed theater, dinner, and social events. In 1887, a Grand Army campfire meeting heard an address by Governor Thayer. The governor was welcomed by an old veterans procession with a Wymore drum corps and a 17-gun salute from Captain Murdoch's battery. In 1890, a grand ball was held at the Opera House as part of Wymore's 4th of July celebration. Also that year, the Order of Railway Conductors had a grand ball welcoming 400 guests. The banquet was served next door at the Touzalin Hotel. In 1895, the Nebraska State Horticultural Society held their summer meetings there. On the main floor, the northwest corner of the building was rented as a billiard hall as early as 1886. When the building was sold in 1901 to S.D. Killen of Beatrice, the name was changed to the Wymore Opera House, and M.S. McGugan opened his Shamrock Saloon. It was taken over by another Irishman, Dan O'Donnell, in 1911. Through the summer of 1909, a second story was constructed over the Laughlin Drug Store over on Niagara Street. The new Trailer Opera House was opened in September 1909 to much fanfare, but its story ended quickly on June 30, 1910, when a fire broke out in the basement of the nearby Cutshall and Kumro grocery store. The fire destroyed 3 buildings in the corner of what is now 7th and F Street, and the Taylor Opera House was among the losses. Sherman Taylor declined to rebuild. The old Wymore Opera House, which had been silent for a couple of years, was repaired and painted, New scenery was constructed, and the owners reopened it in the fall. This photo shows a glimpse of a November performance of the popular Girl from the USA. For years, the word around town was the old building was structurally unsound. In the summer of 1915, Killen made arrangements to have the building torn down to build several brick flats on what was then Edison Street. The demolition dragged on for several years, with the sidewalks littered with brick and debris. In 1916, the city began a condemnation proceeding, and Mayor Rollins was appointed to have the building appraised. It was appraised for $1,000, and Killen owed $480 in black property taxes. This photo shows the state of the demolition in July of 1916. It also documents the location of the old Shamrock Saloon. In June of 1918, the last of the Opera House was torn down and the basement cleared. Construction of the new brick fire hall on the northwest corner of the lot was begun. In 1890, Block 29 was filled with flourishing businesses. Most impressive of all, and billed as one of the finest in Nebraska, was Wymore's new hotel. Imagine for a moment stepping down from the depot in the 1890s to the site of this hotel and a glimpse of a bustling city all around. Just to the north, along Nebraska Street, stood the Livsey Opera House. Across the street to the east awaited a livery stable offering the finest teams of horses and buggies in the county. If you were in town for the day, a ticket on the Wymore Blue Springs Railway offered a ride through downtown, past the town churches, through Blue Springs, across the Blue River Bridge to the Union Pacific Depot and back. The hotels, restaurants, saloons, and businesses catered to the men of the railroad as well as its customers. Construction of the Touzalin Hotel began in July 1886. Measuring 78 by 130 foot, with 3 stories and a deep basement, it was heated with steam, lighted with gas, and featured hot and cold running water. It was named in honor of Albert E. Touzalin, who was president of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. With a fine dining hall, saloon, and 65 well-appointed rooms, the impressive Victorian structure held its grand opening on October 1st, 1887. It would welcome people through its doors for the next 75 years. In 1887, Albert Newell Davison was 28 years old when he left his position at the Potter House and was hired to manage the Touzalin. In the early 1880s, Albert and his wife Jenny met as boarders in the Henry House Hotel in the notorious Cowtown, Abilene, Kansas. They were married in 1882. In 1887, the couple took up residence in a basement apartment of the Touzalin. A charismatic couple, they were very popular in Wymore society, and the hotel benefited greatly through the next decade from local banquets and events, as well as travelers arriving by train. Imagine the wall-papered parlors and dining rooms with flower-laden wedding parties, festive Christmas and Sunday dinners, tinseled New Year's Eve parties, school and business events with guests dressed in formal attire. Orchestras offered dance music and dinners served at midnight, lasting into the wee hours of a summer's night. In 1890, the Davisons' apartment shared a large basement of the hotel with J.A. Mosley, who opened a barber shop to accommodate hotel customers. The basement also housed utilities and laundry. Curiously, the basement walls extended out under a portion of the hotel porches, openings which can be seen below the porches in photographs. The kitchen was located on the northwest wing of the building. Above it on the second floor were the boarding rooms for hotel staff. The Touzalin was a popular campaigning stop for presidential candidates. William Howard Taft on October 1st, 1908. Taft is pictured here. And William James Bryan spoke from the second floor on October 15th. The Touzalin held court to Theodore Roosevelt in 1912. We'll come back to the Touzalin a bit later. In 1900, the Sanborn map shows the floor plan of the hotel. On the other side of the block, the buildings on Niagara Street had recently diminished and were beginning to rise from the ashes. On the north side of Niagara Street, the saloons offered thirsty travelers an assortment of alcohol refreshments. Wymore somehow managed to restrict their business locations to this block. By 1899, there were 4 saloons operating there. When John and Katrine Peiser signed a warranty deed for Lot 19 in May of 1881, the town had just been platted. The Peiser name would be heard on the block for the next 60 years. In 1886, a cigar factory was operating out of a small building. In April 1889, Peiser expanded the building to accommodate a new saloon and billiard hall. That year, 4 liquor licenses were issued on Block 29, Hackler and Company on the Peiser lot, George Knoll on Lot 17, Melvin Rawlings next door on Lot 18, and Albert Davidson over at the Touzalin Hotel. By the end of 1889, Hackler and Peiser dissolved their association, and John Peiser took over operations of the saloon. In the early 1890s, John was traveling east to establish himself as a Wymore agent for distillers and breweries. As a new agent for Pabst Brewing Company, Peiser had the Pabst refrigerator facing the depot painted with his name placed as agent. In 1895, John turned over his retail operations to David Knoll in order to focus on his wholesale business. At midnight on January 25, 1896, the Peiser and Rawlings saloons were discovered in flames. The Peiser building was a wreck, however the Rawlings building fared much better. In September 1896, Pabst Brewing Company came to John's rescue, temporarily buying Lot 19 and arranging to erect a brick structure 25 by 80 foot and 2 stories high. Opened in August of 1897, the new saloon boasted a full basement, maple floors, and exterior trimmed in brownstone with pilasters finishing off the walls. Upstairs, 2 offices for the wholesale operation had handmade windows overlooking Niagara Street. The back of the building had a large hall to be used for dances and public gatherings. 126 years later, that building stands today as the oldest on the block. Christmas at the saloons in 1897 was a special occasion. Peisers offered possum and applesauce, baked sweet potatoes, and quail on toast, as well as hot wienerwurst, all of which were served in courses. The Touzalin bar offered turkey and cranberry sauce. Dos Equals had a large lunch menu, and Tyson's advertised lunch with champagne on ice. Life was never dull on Block 29. In 1883, a saloon keeper erected a high-board pen to enclose his victims when they drank too much to navigate the streets with safety. From 1890 onward, saloon owners Rawlings, Peiser, and Knoll were often arrested together for illegal liquor sales, often selling on Sundays. Damage suits were filed by women who charged their husband troubles were due to liquor sold in the saloons. They were often visited by members of the local Women's Christian Temperance Union, demanding the saloons be closed. In May of 1899, cards were passed around announcing the Gaiety Club, opening in the upstairs hall over Peiser's saloon. What turned out to be a new gambling hall had a short run, being shut down 5 months later. John Peiser passed away at the age of 70 in January of 1916. He had retired to a farm near Oquito several years before. If nothing else, he was spared the new prohibition law passed that year in Nebraska. It was passed almost simultaneously with limited women's suffrage, and with the full support of the Nebraska Women's Suffrage Association. By law, there would be no more booze when the law formally went into effect in 1917. A full 2 years before national prohibition became the law of the land in October 1919, Nebraska became a target for bootleggers. Gangsters from Chicago were known to ride the trains to Wymore, scoping out their contacts, staying in hotels, and ordering fine suits from the local tailor. This would go on until the repeal of the 18th Amendment in 1933. Through much of Prohibition, the old Pizer building was used as a parking garage, a good-paying enterprise close to the depot. In 1937, Harry Marples, John Pizer's grandson, purchased the building at a sheriff's sale for $495. He opened Marples' Firestone store there in 1941 and sold the business to Al Wood in 1951. Harry passed away in 1956, and the building was sold out of the Marples name in 1964. Melvin Longstreet Rawlings deeded Block 18 in February of 1884 and proceeded to build a saloon next to the Pizer Saloon. He would go on to marry his sweetheart, Ludi, in 1888 and build a lucrative ice business servicing customers in 3 states. He served 3 terms as Wymore's mayor. A controversial figure in the community, the newspapers spent many creative columns revering and complaining about the man. His home still stands in Wymore. His saloon survived the 1896 fire, but in 1907, Rawlings built 2 impressive building blocks on lots 17 and 18. With Prohibition, Rawlings leased the building to the Cornhusker Garage and had the front of the building remodeled in 1919. It was operated by Frank Herman into the 1940s. When Rawlings passed on in 1940, the lots were auctioned off as an estate sale in 1943. Virgil Marshall owned the property until 1982, when the building was gutted and refaced in 1953 to service the new Safeway store. Frank Dosickle was an early pioneer of Wymore. He rented one half of a small building on Lot 16 for his shoe shop. In 1894, he bought the lot and had plans drawn up for a brick building 25 by 80 foot, 2 stories high. He rented a small building for his shoe shop on the east side of Block 29, south of the Opera House. This is a 1910 photo of his new brick building showing a load of beer being delivered. Ed Jonas operated a saloon there for only a few months, leaving town suddenly with bills unpaid. Here's a photo of Frank Dosickle after he took the building back over later in the year. He was 53 at the time. In 1923, the property was sold to Priscilla Fouts. It is unclear whether any business occupied it until it was sold at sheriff's sale in 1937 to Grace Small. In the spring of 1937, the Cozy Theater was opened with a picture titled Murder Goes to College. The Smalls had completely remodeled the building. The first floor was made into an up-to-date theater with a seating capacity of 300. The walls were covered with new board. The upstairs was made into 3 apartments, with the Smalls occupying 1. They had previously operated the Lyric Theater north on 7th Street that had burned a few months before. Downtown Wymore on a busy day in the summer of 1940. When Frank LaBelle's old hardware store on the corner of Niagara and Bloomfield caught fire in the midnight hours of March 11, 1899, he was hesitant to invest in the town's new building code requiring brick structures. The events of that early spring would bring a brand-name company from St. Louis to purchase lots 20 and 21 in June of 1900. In October of that year, excavation for the Anheuser Busch building's full cellar began with a completion date for the building targeted for the end of the year. The cost of the new 1-story structure was estimated at $11,000. Measuring 140 by 50 foot, it was to be built of white pressed brick with generous glass on the north and west facing sides. Wymore was pressing the Brewing Company to expand their building plans to accommodate a new opera house on a 2nd story, but the brewery opted to fortify the walls to accommodate a 2nd story should anyone else decide to make the investment. There would be space for 3 small businesses on the north-facing side of the building. The building block to the south, adjoining the Pizer building, was planned for a restaurant. Midway through the brickwork, Minds were changed and bricks removed and replaced with a more pleasing selection. Adolf Ockey settled in Wymore in 1881, engaged in painting and decorating the new buildings in town. In 1883, Dolph, as he was known, established the lunch counter on the grounds across from the B&M depot. For a while he operated a coal business. On May 16, 1902, by popular demand, Dolph opened a well-appointed cafe in the small business spaces of the new Anheuser Busch building. The Ivory Cafe offered seating with snowy white linen, glittering silver, and glassware. Mrs. Ockey and their daughter decorated the space with material fineries of the time. Fine dining was to be enjoyed at modest prices. Dolph tired of the restaurant in 1908, and a new owner opened the Brunswick Cafe in its place, a far less romantic name for the eatery. A cigar factory took up manufacturing in the space to the south. A new state law required the brewery to sell the building in 1907. The building was sold and held by Empire Real Estate for $15,000 and later quit-claim back to Anheuser-Busch in 1917. The famous brewery would own the building through Prohibition and the Great Depression until it was sold to Charles Hemperly in 1943. Hemperly had worked on the railroad until 1910 when he began operating his saloon. That year the building housed the offices of Dr. Fritz, John Smith, Van's Cleaners, and the Hemperly Recreation Parlors. In 1946, Al Wood purchased the business, and it became Al Wood's Recreation Parlor. Hemperly passed on in 1947. Wood's Parlor offered bar snacks to their cigar-smoking, beer-drinking customers. They served cannibal meat, a batch of raw hamburger with onion, salt, and pepper spread on crackers. There was the usual pickled eggs and gizzards. Young Rick Wood used to go to the ice house up the street to get kegs of beer and block ice. On his way back, he would sit on the keg or ice block to cool off on a hot summer's day. Sunday was cleaning day, sweeping, trash removal, and emptying spittoons. Women weren't allowed in the bar. The kids were sent in to fetch Dad home. This 1912 Sanborn map shows 5 saloons and pool halls lining the south end of the 7th Street. Frank Dosickle had moved his shoe shop back to Lot 15. The Opera House is still in operation on the northeast corner, and the Touzalin Hotel graced the southeast corner of Block 29. Traveling back in time to 1915, Wymore's Grand Hotel was making its comeback. This photo shows a rare glimpse of the backside of the hotel, the stairway in the center, and the kitchen and maid quarters upstairs to the north. Heavy debt carried over by its construction haunted the Touzalin. In 1914, the Rock Island Savings Bank called the $9,650 mortgage, and the building and contents were sold at a sheriff's sale. Robert C. Markle, a pioneer resident of Wymore, purchased the hotel for $13,500, and the $9,650 mortgage tagged along. In 1915, $23,150 would amount to $695,000 today. Hoping for a new beginning, the name of the hotel was changed to the Vendome. In 1915, Phil Moser became the hotel manager and oversaw extensive renovation. It appears he also provided the hotel kitchen with fresh produce, strawberries, and onions from his gardens. In 1916, the old saloon was renovated into a dining room with a second kitchen attached to the north. The old kitchen on the northwest wing was used for baking. The large original dining room to the northeast was converted into a dance hall, only to be changed back into a dining room in 1920. In 1915, an underground tunnel was dug from the city electric plant, City Hall, to pipe steam to the hotel to keep the building warm and toasty. The tunnel was large enough to walk through and encased in bricks. With the advent of the devastating fires on both sides of Niagara Street in 1910 and 1914, the steam tunnels were extended beneath the streets to heat other downtown businesses. This is a 1970 photo taken in the basement of the Diamond Bar, representing a boarded-up entrance to one of the tunnels. Legend has it, as the decade wore on and prohibition became the law of the land, the tunnels were used to access saloons and restaurants, making it convenient for people who didn't want to be seen on the streets to move about the city. The Vendome, it was rumored, housed a speakeasy in the basement, and when word came that the law was headed to the hotel, gambling tables, booze, and probably a gangster or two were hidden behind a cellar door in the tunnels. How that seemed a good idea when the city obviously knew about the tunnels is a question worth pondering, and sadly no mention of local speakeasies in the newspapers. In the mid-1920s, hydroelectric power was established on the Blue River at Blue Springs, and the steam plant was closed and the tunnels began to collapse under the weight of the newly bricked streets. In 1925, the hotel featured both a cafe, a fine dining room on the first floor. Redecorations and repairs were perpetual. From 1931 and on through the Great Depression, the upper floors of rooms remained closed, but the first floor space was leased out to various businesses, and the once esteemed dining room, located on the northeast corner, opened its doors as a dance hall. Much of the rest of the building became storage. This is the only known photograph of the interior of the Touzalin Hotel. In November of 1934, freed from the constraints of Prohibition, James Pfizer leased the building and began repairs, cleaning, painting, and redecorating the first floor. Later that year, he opened a bar where the main dining room had been on the northeast side of the building. It was known as the Rainbow Inn. In the summer of 1935, Pfizer opened a liquor store in the old lobby area. In November of 1937, the old hotel fell back into the hands of the city of Wymore. In January 1938, Wymore put to vote a $15,500 bond issue with plans to remodel the old hotel into a municipal building and auditorium. In 1938, $15,500 would equal to $328,000 today. Charles W. Steinbaugh, architect, presented preliminary plans to the city with a proposed cost of the project estimated at $40,083, of which $24,583 was to be furnished by the New Deal Works Progress Administration, the WPA. The remodel projected 40,000 man-hours of labor to be furnished by local business trades. Plans for the building included an auditorium with stage and seating for 500 people, kitchen facilities for preparing banquets. The main floor was to have similar meeting rooms for groups of 50 people, city offices, historical rooms, etc. The basement would have a bowling alley, games, and rooms for youth organizations. Plans called for the third story to be removed and two extensions on the west side of the to be raised, as well as the wooden porches removed. The new rooftop would be refitted as space for outdoor parties. There were provisions for modern heating, plumbing, electrical, as well as extensive interior work, exterior repairs, interior plastering, roofing, and cement floors in the basement. The townspeople voted no to the bond. One cannot help but wonder how the city might have been different if. In February of 1946, the building was sold to Raymond Hevelone. Hevelone moved his machine shop into the first floor. Through that summer, Hevelone gutted the interior of the building, but the brick exterior remained. In the fall of 1946, the third-story roof was lowered and brick walls removed to create a very high one-story interior. Somewhere along the line, Hevelone moved his wife and 5 children into the apartment in the basement. January of 1948 found Hevelone opening a new dance hall where the Rainbow Inn existed 10 years before. The room was remodeled and redecorated, the ceiling lowered, new flooring installed, and new windows set in the walls. There was a new lunchroom planned in connection with the dance hall. Kenny Knowles and his orchestra performed for its opening with door prizes planned. There were plans for old-time dances to be held each Thursday night. In February, the new dance hall opened to an overcapacity crowd. One guy remarked that all you could do was stand and jump up and down. In October of 1949, Hevlon rented the 33 by 130-foot west room of the shop to the Commodity Credit Corporation with an agreement to store 35,000 bushels of shelled corn. A traveling crane in the room was to be used to dump grain trucks and an auger and blower to pile the grain. In late October, the trucks started arriving, but trouble surfaced quickly when the concrete floor at the south end of the building gave away and dumped about 40,000 bushels of grain into the basement. They were still accepting grain to be piled farther north, but his storage space had been cut by 1/4. 7 months later, in June of 1950, the Hevlons heard a noise at midnight outside their basement apartment. It was too dark to look about, so they went back to sleep. Outside, a large section of the brick wall on the west wing where the corn was stored had collapsed. The next morning, shortly after this photo was taken, the remainder of the brick on the west wall came down. Initially, engineering inspections assured the building would support the heavy load of corn, even though it was a known fact the building walls were constructed of soft brick. Weeks later, Ray built back the wall with concrete block, and the corn was shipped to Kansas City for storage. The insurance company paid the claim, but later sued Hevlon for reimbursement of $2,870 of grain that was short in the transaction. When the Hevlon family moved out of town in 1954, the building was sold for storage. What was left of the old hotel was torn down in 1971 to make room for the new fire hall. This is a 1925 Sanborn map of Block 29. Through the Prohibition years, the saloon owners converted their buildings into garages for automobiles. The new Cadman Hotel on the southwest corner of 7th Street provided competition for the old Vendome Hotel, and the Opera House had been torn down. In 1881, a prize for Lot 15 was given to Wymore's firstborn, Donald McGuire. His father, Daniel McGuire, was elected Wymore's first mayor in 1884. Frank Dosickle purchased the lot in 1899. It was unclear when the existing building was built. Daphne Odell rented the building in 1954, and some of you may remember Daphne's Beauty Salon. In 1896, Free E. Hogue was the first proprietor of the Wymore Bottling Works. In February of that year, he boasted putting up 62 cases of mineral water in one day. By 1917, carbonated water was quite popular. Wymore's products were produced by the latest machinery and made out of pure Blue Springs water. A selection could be made from lemon sour, lemon soda, cream soda, root beer, ginger ale, cherry blossom, and gay ole. Other drinks included grape punch, orange, cherry, raspberry, and blackberry. In 1921, they were advertising Country Club, a non-alcoholic beer. By 1929, pop was sold almost everywhere. Hogue partnered with Philip Hornberg. After Hornberg came George Coffey and George Curry, who introduced more modern methods in marketing. They sold out to George Kumro, who sold it to D.H. Huseman in 1922. It is unclear where the business first was located, but in 1916 they moved to one of the Dosickle buildings, and early in 1925 they were renting the south space in the Anheuser Busch building. The stone embedded over the entrance to the brick buildings on lots 13 and 14 shows 1915, but it is unclear when the buildings were actually built. It is possible the buildings were refaced at some point. The Wymore Motor Inn had been operating there until Huseman moved his bottling works in November of 1925. This 1929 photo shows Deb Stewart William Chambers, Dick Huseman, Leland Michnick, and Lloyd Diamond Huseman, its owner. Dick Huseman served several years as mayor of Wymore and on the fire department. His son, Lloyd, worked with him in the bottling business. Dick passed on in 1935, and Lloyd took over the business. Lloyd purchased lots 13 and 14 in 1944. When they partnered with Dr. Pepper, Lloyd designed the diamond logo for the bottles. Forever afterward, Lloyd was fondly known as Diamond. Diamond Bar was in business from 1951 to 1972. It sponsored several sports teams through the years. Lloyd Diamond Huseman passed on in 1972, and the business was managed by Phil Shaw. In 1977, the business was sold to Art and Nadine Weber, and the name changed to the A&N Bar. Bill and Shirley Cook purchased the business in 1980, and Shirley operated it until her death in an auto accident in 2010. When Billy passed on in 2019, the bar was closed. The building is currently going through renovation by their grandson and will hopefully open in the near future. Passed down through generations, the building held one of the oldest beer licenses in Nebraska. In May of 1912, two sisters, Rosa Holmes and Emma Hansen, opened the City Cafe in the North Room of the Central Hotel. Later that summer, they took over management of the hotel. Young Nellie Bly McNown worked in the kitchen until her marriage to Richard Williams on April 2, 1914. It was customary for the kitchen to bake some 60 pies daily. Nellie Williams was Janie Rudder's mother. In May of 1917, Emma Hansen bought lots 10 through 12, where the old Potter House once stood, and began construction on a new hotel. The plans called for a building 50 by 140 foot to be constructed of molted pressed brick of blue and red, 2 stories high, with a full basement. Estimated construction costs $25,000. Emma's daughter, Ruth Cadman, along with her husband, Lester, operated the hotel until their divorce in 1924. The 1920 census shows them living at the hotel along with 17 hotel guests. One guest was Lake Bridenthal. In 1937, Ruth contracted David Manrose to create a wall mural out of dyed plaster for the lobby. In the 1930s, David was working for the Works Progress Administration, painting murals in the Lincoln libraries, and went on to create murals in many of Nebraska buildings. Sadly, many of his murals are gone. Manrose was born in Decatur, Iowa in 1877 and passed on in 1957. Ruth passed on in December of 1954 at the age of 60. Her mother, Emma, sold the building in 1955, briefly to Herbert Mundell, who was researching converting the building into a hospital. When a proposal for the cost came in at $240,000, Mundell sold the building a month later to Alvin Zugmeyer. Zugmeyer sold the Elk Cafe and bowling lanes across the street in 1956 and moved his family into the old Cadman building while researching plans for it. In 1959, Zugmeyer purchased the Wymore bowling lanes and sold the Cadman building to the Evangelical Lutheran Good Samaritan Society in 1960. It was operated as a home for the aged until their new facility, now Hope Wymore, was built in 1976. Lyle Maxson purchased the building that year and briefly opened the Southern Villa Inn, where he operated his barber shop, a 24-hour cafe, and rented the rooms. The building was sold to Bill and Shirley Cook in 1980. It was eventually torn down. Today, Wymore is excited to see the future Wymore Heritage Inn opening in the summer of 2024 on blocks 10 through 12. Through over 140 years of history, time marches on for the people of Wymore. We look with hope to the graduates of Southern High School to take Wymore into its future.